Mark Zuckerberg must be happy. There's no problems this time.
Ikatsu. versus Elon Musk night.
Oh yeah, again.
That's in mommy. Not a big fan, but still, in this case, he's my Katsu.
All right, Biba, live, we are live. Half a day todos samsu buena hudzung. Estigi un nuevo episode para Fanachu. Wawi hosmidzu tatlo si Michael Lujan Bavakwa. Half a day. This is another episode of Fanachu. Once again, I am your host, Michael Lujan Bavakwa. And I am so happy to have we may have 3 people here, but we've got 2 great people already in the Zoom room that are joining us. And onrads and respeto, I want to give special honor and appreciation, respect to my auntie Antoinette Charfauros Mcdaniel, who is the one who inspired this episode. You know, this comes sort of in response to affirmative action being struck down by the Supreme Court in the United States. And a lot of times people many Chamoros may not think that these sorts of things affect them. They may not think that these sorts of larger issues and trends in the United States impact them, or they may think that they affect them in ways that aren't necessarily aligned with the color of their skin or the experiences of their people. And so, for example, many of the conversations that I've had with Chamoros, especially those who are older, say, oh, this is good that it's been struck down. Because, you know, better, like, no one should be judged as getting a better advantage because they look like this or that. And it hurts my heart because, of course, they don't understand, or they may not even make the connection to our own histories of discrimination and suppression, whether it is those who joined the Navy and were forced to be mess attendants, or so many of our elders being forced, manmakastiga puri lenguaje, those who were punished because of the language that they spoke in schools in their own island, right? Compared to, you know, there are still so many Chamoros. I have interviewed so many Chamoros who moved to the US in the 50s and 60s and were not allowed to eat in restaurants or stay in hotels because of the color of their skin. And so it is disturbing for me that so many of our own people don't reflect on how the experiences of, whether it be African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans, the ways in which we are similar, we are in parallel struggles. And so Auntie Antoinette here is somebody who is sort of a cultural curator, a networker, somebody, a scholar, or she might say a recovering retired scholar who, you know, who has seen the best and worst of academia, but has sort of dedicated recent years to really mobilizing the huge amount of Chamoros that live outside of the Marianas and getting them connected to each other and helping them understand the possibilities for higher education. And so, Auntie Antoinette, I want to hand it off to you so you can get this conversation started about the ending of affirmative action and Chamorro pathways to education. And then you can also introduce our other lovely guests, si Jasmine Torres.
All right, Sizu Smasi, and I really want to say Hugo Fagurdesi, Miguel, sa Gofim Patante Estina Conversación. There's very important conversation, and it's one that's easy to miss in the midst of so much happening on island. You know, I want to send out my iguanaitza to the folks on island, to the mutual aid groups, MCCA, Par Todos Hit, you know, Nihi, you know, all the groups that are pulling together and showing the best of our community. There's so many issues that face our community. And yet, you know, it's easy to let this particular issue pass us by in the midst of it, in spite of the fact that decolonial struggle happens in many places all the time, in multiple situations, but they are linked. Our struggles are linked. And I also want to say that I approached Maget, and he had no hesitation whatsoever. This is, in some ways, I see this as a kind of a special emergency rapid response edition of Chamorro Pathways, which takes place annually in the fall, where we bring together, and I want to put a earmark that we bring together current scholars, graduate students, doctoral students, undergrads, and alumni who who can do this sort of one-to-one experiences as I did it, you can do it. And who are there again, the mission of Chamorro Pathways is for Chamorros to demystify, meaning to make it not so scary. What's a FAFSA? Why do I need to, time mamalo about saying, my family has a right to get financial assistance. Although again, now, a lot of that is in question. But we work Chamorros demystify, decolonize, and discover higher ed by listening to one another's stories, which include migration stories. But I also want to give a shout out to all the scholars, Chamorro scholars on island and across the globe who are doing really important work. Mary Therese Perez Hattori at University of Hawaii, and Perez Hattori on island, her sister, a historian I've never gotten the opportunity to meet, and so many others. Saina Laling Torres Sauter. The first book I ever read about Chamorro women written by a Chamorro woman was Daughters of the Island. And then more recently, C. Christine Taitano Delil. I always get the Delil, it's Delil Delil, whose book came out on placental politics. So with that, I want to thank Maguette for allowing me this opportunity to really bring new faces into the conversation, and really to sort of, we cannot, I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm not going to give a full legal précis on all of the various turns or legal history on affirmative action. I'll give you just a little bite of it and talk a little bit about the most recent decision. And then, I approached Jasmine, who's an amazing up and coming, what is your IG handle? Streetwise Doctora, which I love. And she caught my eye on Instagram, and I'm one of the few nanny boomers are on there because I'm constantly scanning who are the young up and coming Chamorros. And I saw that. And when I heard that she was doing an original doctoral thesis on Chamorro students and their cultural identity development, it's like, oh my God, this is so overdue, so I tapped her on the shoulder and I said, hey, Myla Tadiscuti, let's discuss this. And what I've asked her, and hopefully si Vicente Blas-Taijeron, who's based in Hawaii. I don't know if there's some technological issues, but hopefully he's also going to come in and weigh in on his experiences at Colorado College. And if he cannot make it, I'm definitely still going to share his bio. So because these are the up and coming scholars that you need to know. And what I hope everybody takes away from it, whether you have a student in higher ed, whether you're an alum, whether you're now really terrified, am I allowed, should I go forward? And is that other people have done it. We are your family. I'm a first gen scholar, so is Maguette, I believe, and see Jasmine, and we are navigating these spaces, drawing on the strength of our indigenous Chamorro culture, drawing on our values in Afamalik, in Agofliit, Sansuli, but the space of the academy which is some have recently called a settler colonialist university, is not a place where you should necessarily expect to be welcomed. And so it's our job, and I feel like as an elder, having survived it and been disappeared from it and then pushing back in, and saying Manesnon, a word that Maguette actually told me is part of my legacy, is part of my inheritance as a proud Chamorro woman. So with that, I want to introduce Jasmine, who again, I mentioned that I was caught by, I love all these sassy, Instagram posts, which I can't be so sassy. I recently started adding music to my stories, but she's a doctoral candidate at Cal State Fullerton, and again, her original research is on the cultural identity development of Chamorro students attending a 2-year institution. She has 10 years as a TRIO director, and the TRIO programs, for those of you who are familiar, that includes early outreach, Upward Bound, and others, but the TRIO programs were funded and come out of the civil rights movement, as did affirmative action. It has to be seen as part of that effort to to address violence, discrimination, and exclusion against people of color, against Indigenous people, and against us too, Chamorus Loqui. So hopefully Ben will come join us. He's in Hawaii, and I understand, I think it's okay to say that, please pray for his father. I think there's some health issues. But let me just mention, so people know about this young man who's just so impressive. He's an undergraduate currently at Colorado College. His major is feminist and gender studies. He's minoring in race, ethnicity, and migration. He's the student body president, which he's so mamalo that I didn't even know this until I asked him for his bio. I was like, whoa, dude, you're taking up space, which is what we want people to do. So he's the head of the student body, student government. He's a peer mentor, and he's a spiral fellow in the Colorado College chaplain's office. So please pray for his father, his family, and also that hopefully he can join us at some point. So with that, let me just talk a little bit, and we started late, so there's not as much time. So I'm not a legal scholar. I'm just going to tell you about the recent case. So on June 29th, 2023, SCOTUS, which is short for the Supreme Court of the United States, found that affirmative action programs at Harvard College and the University of North Carolina were unconstitutional, that the affirmative action programs that they created and offered, which, mind you, I want to really make a really important point. All admissions are holistic. Race is only one piece of a larger pie. And now we're talking about legacy admissions. If your great grandfather, if you have somebody's name on a building, chances are you might not have been so-called qualified. And, we can think about George W., right? Gentlemen C, but you get in, athletes, musicians, etc. So it's only one part of it, but they found for the plaintiffs who were the students for fair admissions, and talk about, a non sequitur. It's a group that is funded by a number of deep-pocketed, conservative funding agencies that have been funding similar cases going back to UT Austin, and found that white plaintiffs were not as convincing, and so they shifted to Asian Americans as kind of a proxy for white students to say, our rights are being violated, less qualified people are being admitted over, my high ACTs, etc. So, and it's important to denote here very quickly that Asians were being knowingly used as, sort of the model minority. And if you're not familiar with that term, the model minority for Asian Americans suggests, well, they're not as bad. Look, they work hard, they got good grades, right? Not taking into account, changes in immigration law, or maybe their parents came over and they came with, they were the children of educated people who are not necessarily allowed to practice as lawyers. The people, are running those, corner stores in New York or LA, they may actually have medical degrees, but they were not allowed, again, you have to think about it generationally, to practice their profession, but they were allowed to immigrate following changes, which are part of immigration changes to immigration laws that were based on actual racial quotas that were extremely racist from the turn of the century. Getting off topic, but the point is here that the students for fair admissions, quote unquote, were their case, SCOTUS ruled in their favor 6-3 in the University of North Carolina case, and 6-2, 6-3 in the UNC case, and 6-2 in the Harvard case, because the first Black woman on the Supreme Court, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, recused herself, although interestingly enough, Clarence Thomas never did, and I'm sure he was a recipient. I'm going to keep going forward. So Justice Sotomayor, as I'll remind you, is the first Latino justice on the Supreme Court. And she characterized the decision as having a devastating impact that cannot be overstated. Justice Brown Jackson said, it would be deeply unfortunate if the Equal Protection Clause actually demanded this perverse ahistorical and counterproductive outcome. So the other thing I want to mention is that the ending of affirmative action is not just restricted to universities. This is going to have, although it does affect universities in terms of recruitment, support for students of color and Indigenous people. But the point here is that it's going to have a domino effect that goes beyond universities, because the first use of the term affirmative action came in 1961 when John F. Kennedy used the term to take affirmative action using Executive Order 10295 in 1961 for that there be affirmative action to ensure that applicants employed and employees are treated during employment without regard to race, creed, color, or national origins. So this will go beyond the university to hiring practices. And so believe me, we're focusing, as is my specific niche, so to speak, even though I care about all these other spaces and issues on the impact of affirmative action. So with that in mind, I invited Jasmine, or Auntie Jazz, to others because she's not a tea nanny. She's a nanny to me. My rule is you have to call me Auntie if I could have babysat for you. If you're not at least 50 or older, it's Auntie or Professor. I prefer Auntie or Auntie Tia, new nickname, which I really appreciate. So when I approached both Jasmine and Ben, I said, I really want to center our stories. I want to see that we can't do a deep dive on the history of affirmative action. I will let some other scholars take that on. But I do want to know, how does this impact? How do you feel about it? How does this hit you? Because I know I was apoplectic, and I posted something long and said, to be continued part 1, this is my part 2, right? Is this podcast is part 2 to that original post of outrage and indignation. So I wanted to ask Jasmine, how do you see this impacting you? Tell us a little bit about your work and what the implications are for your work in higher ed.
Titus Masi, I definitely want to, just thank my Tiha Professor Antoinette. Just to have somebody, tap me just from social media, I was very humbled and taken aback, especially, Professor Miguel Babakwa. I'm over here citing you in my doctoral papers, and to have this honor to share space with you to discuss things that are very important to me is definitely a blessing. So yeah, when Auntie asked, how would you like to be addressed? I've never done this before, but I said, you know what, call me Zas or Jasmine, because that is the accent of the Magaaga before me and my favorite aunties. And I see myself as a Magaaga and elder in training. So I said, I've never introduced myself, but let me throw some love to my aunties calling me Jas or Jasmine, because hopefully they're all watching. But so before I weigh in, I definitely want to give a brief background of my diaspora story. So on my mother's side, I'm diasporic Chamoru of the clan Chargola Finotnya, Familia Ingles of the village of Agate, Garden Grove, post-Vietnam War. So, everybody has their story of how they made to the mainland. On my father's side, I am Chicano, so I'm mixed of the Maheno family of Paramount, California, El Monte, California, Garden Grove, upon the union of my parents. I am a first-gen college grad when it comes to bachelor's, master's, and now as a doctoral candidate. Triple Titan, all my degrees are local because as the firstborn daughter, lots of responsibility and to stay, with my clan. But yes, I'm preparing a study aimed at better understanding the experiences of Chamorro undergraduates navigating their cultural identity development, and specifically how they see the role of the institution and institutional agents. What should they play in that process? Because students are entering a settler colonial space. And we are currently colonized, even though we have a fancy word called territory attached to the island, but we are a colony. So there is no post-colonial paradigm for us, and what are those implications? So thank you for bringing up my TRIO experience. Definitely excited. I'm a TRIO alum from Cal State Fullerton, so definitely almost a decade supporting TRIO. And then just for context for those who are watching and listening, Auntie mentioned how, JFK entered affirmative action into our lexicon in 61. MLK Jr. had his I Have a Dream speech in 63. And then JFK proposed the Civil Rights Act, the amended act in 63, and passed the same year. And so it passed after his assassination and took effect in 65. And so when Lyndon B. Johnson had the opportunity to step into the president role and came in with the war on poverty, that was the birth of TRIO programs. And so I want to explain this because they're so interwoven. Going back to what Auntie said about how Justice Brown Jackson said, this is perverse and ahistorical. Because if you're not looking at the history of what was happening at the time affirmative action entered the lexicon, at the time that MLK Jr. had his speech, and you say we don't need affirmative action, it is absolutely ahistorical. We're forgetting the fight that took place in all the versions of the civil rights pursuit. So I just, wanted to kind of interweave those things. But I'm nervous as a TRIO director. The fate of TRIO programs have always been contentious because our programs are congressionally funded. And so our status as programs is literally a political one. For those of you that don't know, Guahan has TRIO programs. So Guahan has at the community college and the university TRIO programs. Those practitioners do get opportunities to come and break bread and discuss the issues that are happening on island. And I can tell you right now from those conversations, we're experiencing the same issues. Even if folks think there's like a homogenous group on island, students are all having the same issues because as we enter the academy and then we get into places where we can access social mobility and access what Lyndon B. Johnson called the war on poverty, we need to be able to be seen for our capacity, not the settler colonials' idea of what our capacity is. And that ties to my dissertation because how do we develop our identity when, how do we identify our identity when our identity has constantly been told to us and our narrative has constantly been said for us? So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and pause there, but I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to weigh in. And I will say that these issues affect Chamorros, whether you're in TRIO or not, because there's several advocates and advocacy organizations trying to get us into these spaces. And we can talk a little bit further about our invisibility and our erasure, because of this. But I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic back to Auntie.
Yeah, I really appreciate everything you mentioned in terms of context, especially. And TRIO has a special place in my heart because I consider my first teaching experience to be the summer of my junior year at UCSD, where Miguel is also an alum, where he got his doctorate degree. In fact, his thesis advisor was my comadre, the brilliant Yen Le Espiritu, who has been the chair of ethnic studies. And Miguel, I don't know if you remember, you organized a Pacific Island Studies and Ethnic Studies conference, and I attended, and we were both in a panel, so we go pretty far back. But I remember I was a junior going into my junior year. It was the summer of my junior year, and I was very politicized by this time. Things had taken root. It's like, wait a minute, I day as that you start having to grasp for knowledge that's been denied. Again, that knowledge has been denied us. It's systematically denied. The curriculum is selective. It is, classrooms are not neutral. So when we feel this oftentimes, we can feel it in our bodies when we walk into a space. And again, I taught every part of my experience in the academy as a diaspora Chamorro sociologist was in PW, predominantly white institutions, for those not familiar with that term, where I was the first or only Indigenous person, let alone Pacifica person, let alone Chamorro person. And I was short besides. Right. So, this petite Chamorro, and believe me, that's where I found my voice, because there was so much erasure, as you said. But trio programs, that's where I cut my teeth with teaching when I was a residential counselor. So trio programs have a deep resonance for me, and I love that you are part of that, and that's your work. But I also want to mention something about context. If we really think about, the genealogy, the legal genealogy of the 14th amendment to the Constitution, which was one of the things cited in the SCOTUS case, that there was a violation of equal protection under the law. It is such a perversion. And in a previous case, SCOTUS case, I'm not going to cite the case, but I believe it was in the 1940s. One of the justices said, it's so important to remember the context in which the equal protection clause was introduced, and it was following the Civil War, right? And the idea was to protect recently freed enslaved persons from additional violence and disenfranchisement, right? So even through that, history, along with a larger settler colonialist history, and not to mention our 500 years of colonization in Guahan, which ties all of us together, irrespective of, as again, our families become more diverse, our identities are increasingly more intersectional. If they ever weren't, again, we're trying to come back together to understand that classrooms and universities were selective places, and that modern universities in particular, since this is where my area of expertise, were really based on and created for originally going back to Harvard for all white men, and specifically for clergy, Protestant clergy. Who did not see women as full human beings, and certainly, worked with the law, to justify their myopia. I think what I'd like us to turn to at this point is really how, the other question I wanted you to think about or respond to is, what do you want other Chamorros to know about the importance of pursuing higher ed in spite of, and I think Maguette will agree that so much of our experience through higher ed is as a kind of protest. There's a way in which, even, especially in a PWI, your body is a site of contestation. As a professor, unlike my colleagues, I was questioned from the beginning of my career to the end. Where are you getting this? Do you ask your chemistry professor, where are you getting this information from? No, you don't ask your chemistry or your physics professor. Where are you getting this? But my knowledge was questioned. My authority was constantly questioned, which is in part why I continue to use the professor title, because it's not just, it is who I am, and it's what I do, and no institution gave that to me. I profess the knowledge, the aesthetics, the politics, the liberation of my people and others. So what would you like other Chamorros to know? And Maguette, you can please chime in as well. Given that now they're even higher, what SCOTUS is doing is, we're going to make it even harder for you to get in. We're going to discourage you. So what do you want other Chamorros to know about the importance of continuing to pursue higher ed, despite the court decision?
One thing that I just wanted to chime in, si dus masinu hamzuna dos na ina insanganiam na pudi experience minzu. Thank you for sharing your experiences. This is such an important topic. I did just want to chime in though, because you were talking about how, that bodies in certain spaces in academia, for example, they're treated as hostile, right? The knowledge is treated as hostile because in a sense, and this is true for all racialized groups, but for indigenous people, it's a little bit different because in a sense, we were supposed to disappear.
Exactly.
Right? That we were supposed to have been wiped out. Our language was supposed to be silenced. And so,
Right.
in that mindset, I always tell people, Edzaki finot Chamorru, Ketungwe finot Chamorru, learn the Chamorru, Usai finot Chamorru, because it was supposed to die. And so whenever you speak it, and not just Gihalamun Guput, like with your family, right? But if you speak it, even if you are a greeter at Walmart in a place where there's no Chamorro for 200 miles, use some Chamorro, incorporate it into your day. And when you do that, you are pushing back against sort of the fate that was decided for us by colonization, modernity. You are helping push back. And so I just wanted to chime in there. Lo, por favor, consegui, go ahead.
No, please, because I've seen, when I think about language reclamation, as someone who started learning Chamorro when I was 58 with Maget, right? In 2020, what I often said is, this was a form of, Aide, Estegisi, Ben, Viva, Vicente, I'm so glad. Tadzagua. But, to Maget's point, it's really important to understand that this was a form, according to one Maori scholar, this was a form of linguistic genocide, which is part of the totality of settler colonial moves, protocols, right? The archive, we don't exist, our knowledge doesn't exist. And, one of the things that has just amazed me in curating talent and speakers for the Chamorro webinar, it almost makes me angry. There's so many brilliant Chamorros. And part of the brilliance, and something no one can ever take away from you, part of the brilliance in using the metaphor of light is just to shed light on our stories, on our families, on our survival, on our refusal to ever completely succumb, which is why, for me, Manesnan is now a very important part of my identity. That, we are unconquerable when all is said and done. Ben, I'm so glad that you are here. I actually already introduced you because I said, even if you cannot make it, this is a very special, amazing person. I think the other thing I want to point out is this is a trans-Pacific conversation. Maget, where the origins properly of the podcast come from, is in our homeland, Guahan, Sumasaga Gitzaguahan. Vicente's in Hawaii, right? With the Kanakamale, the Lana Itano na Kanakamale. Jasmine, or Jas, is in California, and you can share the genealogy of the folks whose land you are on. And now, Ben, I was praying you could make it. So say hello. And I just catch you up really quickly. I gave a little overview about the SCOTUS decision. And, at this point, what I'm asking, I did introduce you. What I'd like you to talk about now, we're at this next part of the program, so to speak, this special edition of Chamorro Pathways. What do you want other Chamorros to know about the importance of still pursuing their education despite the recent SCOTUS decision? And Sitsus Masi for joining us.
May Guahosi Vicente Blas-Taijeron tato Guahanzu dan sumasagatugi sa morning. Thank you all for having me. I think for me, being an undergraduate, I'm an undergraduate, as Thea probably had mentioned at Colorado College, is the importance of diversity within our classrooms, right? As a Chamoru, how often are our voices heard on the scales in higher education? How often are our voices amplified? And for me personally, as a feminist and gender studies student, a lot of what we talk about from the work of feminist scholars like Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks is this idea of positionality. How have our various identities we've held, our social, our social backgrounds, how have they influenced the kind of power we have and the influence we have in our society? And so Chamorus as colonial subjects, and even more so as people who are ripped from our homeland, for those of us in the diaspora, how does that influence, and how can that be, how can our identities influence higher education for the better? And so with this policy change, we see a lot of detrimental things that have to do with Chamorros within higher education. There may be less of us who are able to, affirm our identity on papers and have to explain the complexities, rely on our college essays to explain the complexities of our identity, which we're so often confused about as Chamorros and as colonial subjects. We don't oftentimes know how to articulate it properly. I will say that in my experiences as a current undergrad, there is a lot of richness and diversity within the classroom. And in fact, just alluding briefly to a study done in 2004 at Stanford, in which two professors there did two exercises. They used a group of white identifying students and a group of people of color mixed with white students. And they gave them both case studies, murder case studies, and the same clues, same set of facts. And they had found that the groups with more diversity were able to solve the case in a more proficient manner because of the diversity of thought. And so when we see that and we model higher education around diversity and around being conscious of the different positionalities we hold, we end up with environments that foster more creativity, more innovation. And that's, for me personally, what has made my college experience so enriching. And so, to the Chamorus listening, and of course to our people, be aware of this and understand that when we go for these opportunities, our voices are important, and these policies are important for us to focus on, to learn about, and to learn just how much they impact us as colonial subjects.
Very good. Thank you. Jess, did you want to chime in and say, mention something else? I also noted we did create a Google Doc, because who knows, maybe an article will come out of this, a conference, something like that, on how we respond. But I noticed that you said that Chamorros are the fastest growing Pacific Islander populations over the last decade. The other point I want to make is that the shift of our population, I've often talked about the Midwest is kind of the diaspora of the diaspora, and I'm my daughter and I are a perfect example of it. My father was a child during World War II, the occupation. He, as a 19-year-old man, along with many Chamorro men, as Miguel has documented and researched, joined the Navy because, as he said, there were very few opportunities. And the fact that there were few opportunities for jobs was not accidental. It was part of Americanization modernity. So he moves and eventually settles in San Diego, which has the largest population of off-island Chamorros. I then moved to I go back east for graduate school and end up settling in Ohio, where I also raised my daughter. My daughter then attends school at University of Michigan, moves to Detroit as an artist, and is now based in Brooklyn with a lot of amazing there's this nice cadre of incredible Chamorro badass women, as I think that the millennials say, in Brooklyn. But the idea here is that I think we need to think about Chamorros who may be not seen even that much more outside of California, right? The struggle is still real in California in the Northwest, but the struggle is different and in some ways exacerbated in the place where in the 2020 census, it showed that the region with the greatest growth of Pacific Islanders was the Midwest. And their new prima, Barbara Cepeda, just relocated. Her daughter is a doctor at Cleveland Clinic. Her son is I think a 5th grade teacher in Detroit. So we need to think about, context and, as Vicente said, positionality. And this is part of, for me, the urgency of this conversation. We need to generate ideas. We need to have the conversation. We need to pierce the silence that this does affect us. This is important because it was already hard it was already difficult. And, while I often tell people, I've been waiting for you for 30 years, I've been alone out here in the diaspora and in these institutions that are often hostile. You're here now. But even as there's something that could, again, Maguette is one of the first PhD students, in ethnic studies, with a critical analytical framework, with faculty who could support that set of ideas, which is very different from my experience. Now, Jasmine is the next up and coming generation, but just as we are getting a foothold, right, we again have this reversal. And so at this point, I want us to think about the importance of mobilization. Like, what kinds of ideas do you have to share with us? This is, again, kind of a rapid response conversation. What do we need to do now? And I'm not professing to have those answers, with the exception of saying, go back to the basic values. Inafamele, community, sensuality, inagofli'i. We will do for ourselves. We will not be turned around. But so my question now for the panel, and this again includes Maguette, what suggestions do you have for Chamorros in order to mobilize, to address our systematic exclusion, especially taking into account that we now have additional, they refer to a Sisyphean climb, where the myth of Sisyphus is where there is this mortal who is destined to roll this boulder up a hill that's curved. So he gets it up the hill, it rolls right back down. And so this is a Sisyphean task. And I refuse to succumb. I refuse to cooperate. This is one of my mottos. I refuse to cooperate with my own disappearance. And I have a long history of being disappeared. And I keep popping back up, and I will continue to do so and haunt them. I want to go back to something Ven told me, Vicente. I said, remember that young man in Tennessee, the legislator that got kicked out, and then he came back and he used this quote that was so powerful. He said, they thought to bury us. They did not know we were seeds. And he said, oh, that's Tupac. It's like, okay, I know who Tupac is. And now I know this beautiful. So again, let's brainstorm here. That's the point of this rapid response conversation. What suggestions do you have for us to think about mobilizing, and how can we do it in such a way that somebody in Tennessee, quote unquote, by themselves does not feel alone?
I want to say first, I want to go back to something Auntie said. In my research for my dissertation, one of the things that caught me was, in California specifically, diasporic Chamorro high school graduation rates are in the upper 80, 90 percentile, right? But then you have this huge leak somewhere, because we're not seeing that percentage of students going to college. That number is a lot smaller. I want to say it's like 26% of those that do attempt to go to college. They're not persisting. They're not completing. And I want to pull from Ben as well, talking about how diversity and how he's one of the first Pacific Islanders, specifically Micronesian, specifically Chamoru, and newly diasporic Chamoru, having that voice. And that's what I would say is, it doesn't take for you to be completely radical or political, but approach these things with wonder, approach these things with understanding of where's the disconnect. Because like Ben said, Chamorro students, when they're serving as active participants in the higher ed experience, that's an essential aspect of critical pedagogy. When problems arise and they're able to be solved, like Auntie said, we can introduce Chinchuli, and not, quoting Professor Bavakwa, it's not just about giving tangible things, right? It's about getting back to social responsibility. And that is the heart of affirmative action. We are all responsible for the equity of this nation. That's the core of TRIO programs. We are all responsible for the opportunity and social mobility. That's our job, all four of us here as educators, but it all goes back to our core, Inafamalik. And I guess for me, I would encourage my fellow Chamorro to figure out why there is that gap. what do we believe about college that we don't believe about high school? We're graduating high school in high rates. How can we get you and become the wayfinders with you and connect you to the colleges that you can succeed at and help you through and expand our own knowledge? And then just, a final thought, Professor Bevacqua, mentioned, I'm not fluent in Chamorro, and I'm nervous sometimes to even have that conversation or to speak, where I get nervous, but then I remember it's not my responsibility for having my language and my culture taken from me. So I told him I was going to get shirts made that says "Ain't no shame in my reclaim," because at 40 years old, I'm on that reclamation journey, and I welcome, before I ask everybody to mobilize and address underrepresentation, it starts with us and reclaiming the narratives and the language and the culture and everything taken from us. And so that's where I would encourage us to start.
Oh, Biba, that's beautiful. Ben, what would you say?
Yes, Jesus Masi, Tia Jasmine, for that. I think for me too, coming from this upcoming generation of junior scholars, is the importance of us really collectivizing and building kind of coalitions around this issue. We know that there is a policy change we've established, and we think that it's unjust. But where do we go from here? Well, for back home, right? There have been groups of Chamoru college students. Horizons Guam comes to mind, led by Cirilla Rapadas, that are kind of thinking about, what does the college experience look like for Chamorros in the States now, and how can we kind of funnel more of our people into these colleges, into these universities. I also want to note specifically for the diaspora, as I was just reading earlier, Chamorros are ethnically are the most widely dispersed oceanic ethnicity within North America. And so I think a lot of times for us, as I'm learning as a new diasporic subject, a lot of time it's difficult for us to find each other and to really seek out and build these communities. When we think about where are hotspots for our people, Tacoma and San Diego come to mind, Honolulu maybe, but there are a lot of us out here that maybe don't have access. And so it's up to us, specifically, I think the younger generation too, to kind of have this responsibility to say, I know that my experience, I'm not completely, I'm not an American, but I'm not fully, a transnational subject. And so we need to think about this experience, characterize it, and say, what can I do to seek out Chamorros who may be near me, who may not be near me, and to kind of think more about how we get each other into higher ed. Because one thing that I've learned is when we are surrounded by each other in these environments, we feel more supported. We feel a sense of belonging, and we are able to succeed in our education and make a name for ourselves, for our families, and for our people. And so that's kind of what I want to see for my generation. What I would tell others is to think about creative ways that we can start kind of collectivizing, knowing that this policy change has happened. Because at the end of the day, right, when one of us is admitted to any university, or one of us is getting our degree, or one of us is getting that job we want, we all win. And that's something that I truly, truly believe about our people. When one of us is succeeding, when one of us wins, we all win. So thank you.
That's beautifully put. I also want to mention, I put a plug in for the Chamorro Pathways Through Higher Education space. Auntie has TADSA technical skills. So TADSA links, I keep calling it Linksys. TADSA Linktree. I go to PISA students and I was like, would you like to be in my webinar? And they're like, who is this lady? Is she stalking me? Is she a Guihan Nakatu? Is she a catfish person? So, volunteer, please follow us. It's at Chamorro Pathways. I'm looking for volunteers. I am, most Nettie boomers my age are not on Instagram, but I am ensconced there because I know that's where you are. And that's why, as your elder, I feel this special responsibility that, I wouldn't call it wisdom, but let me put it this way. My role, as I understand it, is in some ways, I like to think of it, I'm the elder with the machete. and I was there to cut the weeds down. You all are going to, that was my path, and that was my responsibility. That was my destiny. But your responsibility is to pave the path. Do you want to lead it sustainable? You know, however you're going to pave it. But the important thing is to come together in a place where you, with all due respect, do not have to physically be in California or on the Northwest. We need to think in ways that connect us both to our homeland, to the Marianas, that affirm our identity as Chamorros, as colonized people with common cause and a common historicity, but specific challenges in different contexts. You know, I want to sort of end, because I think we're getting close to the end, with a reminder from, you know, a colleague I never had the opportunity to meet, but whose work was so affirming to me, Linda Tuhiwa Smith, who said that it's really important to remember that decolonial struggle is happening, is multi-layered, is multi-dimensional, and occurring in multiple sites simultaneously. And we need to find ways to come together, because it's in community that we are strong. And I was really struck by Auntie Jazz's conversation, or the way you sort of characterized TRIO and affirmative action. You know, if we don't come together, you know, we are sort of dead in the water, so to speak, right? Our strength is in our culture. Taimamalo. And remember that you may be numerically outnumbered, but you are not alone. And you come from a proud indigenous ancient history of 500 years of resistance and many, many millennia of genius, of wayfinding, of innovation. And so that is your legacy. That's our legacy. Let's draw on that legacy as we move forward. But please follow us. I'm looking for volunteers. Please, I need help, because Tadza, technical skills. I need help with, you know, production. I'm good at curating. That's my talent. That's my magic. And it's my responsibility, and it's my promise to you. But Tadza and the millennials, I went back to work after the pandemic, and Auntie was sad. So it's like Fanachu podcast. Here we go. I can count on Miguel to help me get the word out.
To anyone watching, put favor, because, you know, as we say, angen tihita pues hadzi. If we aren't doing it, then who is going to be doing it? And so if you want more opportunities for Chamorros, if you want to elevate the people, if you want to save the language, you want the culture to be perpetuated, you have to think, what is your role? Masaya dididi, masaya dankulu, whether it's small or large, but what is your role in that? And too often, I think Chamorros we have this incredible spirit of thatching the roof, coming together after a storm, of coming together. But we also have this mentality in which, for some of these things, we wait for somebody else to do it. We're waiting for the federal government to do it. We're waiting for the military to take care of it. We're waiting for somebody who's lighter skinned, who speaks English a certain way. We're waiting for them to figure it out. And so that's why put favor to anyone, you know, the Chamorro pathways through higher education work, which hosted past virtual conferences of applying for college, getting scholarships, in which it's out there, but also some of the things that we've discussed today, some of the more philosophical justice-based issues about identity and about sort of self-determination, decolonization. It's all there. So Hungan, I'm happy that this was an emergency version of Chamorro Pathways Through Higher Education, Tiha, Magovzu.
That's cool. Also,
Hungan, and so Tiha, if you can go ahead, and then Jasmine and Vicente put favor. just share your final thoughts, Hungan.
I have already shared my final thoughts, but I wanted to mention that I'm going to be putting together some resources of groups. I know that there is going to be a Chamorro immersion program run by Couture and Chamorro Foundation, and they are partnering with UCLA. I also want to give a shout out to Megetu Tuncap, who was my co-chair in the past, and he does a lot of fantastic work up in Washington. There's also Utopia PDX, and I believe one of the executive directors there is, again, a previous co-chair, Serena Saturn. I think she's at Misterina on Instagram, but please look for resources and earmark. October is usually when we come together. I would love to get some volunteers. I need some help, but we will also be putting in resources from EPIC, which is the Empowering Pacific Islander Community on affirmative action. I believe Teilani Camacho, based in San Diego, is a resource at EPIC as a program coordinator. I touched base with her today and she's aware, but we are going to keep going forward. So again, my final thoughts: follow us, volunteer, and never succumb. We are unconquered and unconquerable. Ben, we end with the out of the mouths of babes, so to speak. The next generation, the rising scholars.
Yeah, I mean, Sijos Mas, Todos Hamzu, and Sijos and Benedi Sihao or Hamzu. I think, just to kind of leave with thinking about, again, the potential of our people and the need for us to really come together at this time, to understand that as Professor Tobacco had mentioned, and if not us, then who? I do see that kind of wondering, and Tia will mention when asking me to come on this podcast, I had this great shame or this kind of feeling of hesitancy of like, me, why am I the one to talk about this? Why have I been picked? And so I think we kind of have this hesitancy as a people to think, we are not in some ways the right ones to do it or good enough, or we're not ready. But in fact, when we think about our people and we think about just how much resilience we have, and resilience in a healthy sense, resilience of colonialism, resilience of being able to kind of reclaim the system that we've been subjected to, then we really need to think about that, and we need to come together as a people and say it's now the time. We deal with too many inequities as Chamorros. We're constantly erased. We're constantly spoken over, right? And so this is yet another opportunity for us to say, let's come together, let's organize, what can we do, and how can we continue to create a pipeline for us to get that education, to build that intergenerational wealth, and to learn and educate ourselves. So Sizos Masi, Todos Hamzu.
I think, Auntie, one last thing on my end that you brought up in our original conversation with Ben and I, when we both came to you, like, why me, Auntie? And you said, Mapoksai, we are your children, right? And Poksai, that's very important to our culture. It doesn't matter if you knew me or didn't know me. And I mentioned, Auntie did a cold call to me on Instagram. My Instagram just started ringing and I'm like, oh my gosh. And I answered, right? But that's how you connect. So Streetwise Doctora, hit me up. Poksai, that's our culture. We nurture, we take people in. I'm an elder in training. I just found out I'm 40, so now I'm elder in training. So I will have Mapoksai as well. So you don't have to be Chamorro. You just have to be about the movement and understanding what we all need. But if you are Chamorro, even more so, please hit me up and I will do my due diligence and I will learn from my elders so I can lift as I climb.
Idzus masinu hamzu todos hugof agradeci hamzu nai hamesti I champun midzu lo I henasun midzu lokuinai por estina sen precisuna asunto. I appreciate all of you sharing and being here to talk about this important topic. Esti Fanachu para estina episode Fanachu Adios, este ki otro viaje.